Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Beth Chats Books. Now today is going to be part one of my December wrap up. So I have read quite a lot of books. So in the last few months I've read quite a lot of books and exceeded my Goodreads challenge. And I think I've done that purely because recently I've been reading 3 books at a time. Now usually I have previously been reading maybe 1/2 at a time, but I've noticed that when I'm reading 3 at a time, some on ebooks, some physical, I've been able to finish them at similar times and therefore in a week finish more than just if I was reading 1 till I finished it. So anyway, I don't know, I've just been playing around with that strategy and that seems to be quite successful. So I'm just going to get stuck in with the books that I have finished reading in the first half, roughly, of December. I finished Girl in the Walls by AJ Noose or Ganoose. I don't know whether that G is silent or not. This is a book that I got approved by NetGalley and it's published by Fourth Estate. And this story follows a girl who lives in the walls of her old family home. It is now lived in by a family with 2 sons. But in the beginning of the story, we find out that she lost her parents in a car accident at a very young age and she didn't know what to do. So she returned to her old house that she lived in with her parents and is literally living in the walls. Now, I thought this was going to be slightly different than what it ended up being. It has bits of magical realism / thriller-esque because at the beginning of the novel you're trying to figure out really whether she's physically living in the walls or not, but then it becomes a lot more realist when the brothers try to expose her. They believe she is living in the walls, they just don't know who she is. The plot was very thin and I didn't really know where it was going to go, and I feel like the author wrote themselves into a corner and therefore we just didn't have a lot of room to take the story. And I think for a lot of people what would interest them about this book is the kind of mystery surrounding somebody in the space and maybe playing more on whether that's real or not, but we knew quite early on that it was literally a girl living in the walls and sneaking out and having cereal when they went to school and work. And I just kind of didn't realise that was literally going to be the novel, and I just didn't know where it was going to go. And then it really started to drag towards the end. It felt like the last 20% of the novel just wouldn't end, and I'd kind of lost interest by then. So I gave this 2 out of 5 stars, which is a really harsh rating for me. Usually I don't do very often 2 or under ratings unless I just really didn't enjoy it. But some people might find this book interesting, but the plot was very one-dimensional. There wasn't much character development. We weren't introduced to many characters and it was very insular, and I just kind of didn't see where you could go with the plot. So from about 40% in, I was already out, if that makes sense. So there's that one. Then I read Death in Her Hands by Tessa Moshfegh, and I absolutely loved this novel. Now, a lot of people won't, and I think Tessa Moshfegh is definitely an author that you gel with or you don't. I absolutely loved Eileen when I read it a few years ago, and then I read My Year of Rest and Relaxation, and I didn't enjoy it quite as much as the whole rest of the world seemed to, but I did enjoy it. She's got a very macabre and dark type of style of writing, and she is a very unique writer. The way she writes feels very filmic and experimental and different, and I think some people either find that writing style too dark and depressing and they just don't get into it, but I find it very, very clever, the way she gets under your skin as a writer, and the way that her characters are always very odd, but not in that kind of one-dimensional trope of making them seem either psychopathic or autistic. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of authors play on either a psychopath, no emotion at all, or they pick a character like somebody who is on the spectrum who finds it difficult to communicate. And her characters don't really fall into either of that category, but there's always something a little bit different. Now, this character choice was really interesting because this is an old lady and she has her dog. This is kind of in polar opposite to A Girl in the Walls, because this plot seems like, how on earth can you make a novel from this one concept, which is that this old lady goes for a walk in the woods of the new area she lives in the US, and finds this note that says that a woman is dead and the person who wrote the note didn't do it. And then you literally take the story from there, and it's not really a plot. It's not a consistent, tangible plot, but we kind of get into the headspace of this character. And the way Atesha Moshfegh writes, there are pages in here that I think some people won't like, because it is kind of the character's musing and descriptions of her past life and the routine that she does with the dog and the new house and going to the library, and things that people might just think there's no plot and this is boring me. But I think Atesha is so talented that I was completely gripped reading these bits of the book that weren't really a plot, and usually I need a plot to keep me going. But this feels very similar to me to how I had the reading experience of The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides. It is a dark book. You kind of already know slightly at the beginning that there's a death in both novels. The Virgin Suicides backtracks on the sisters and their lives from the perspective of the boys who were obsessed with them. And this kind of goes through the lady's life and her, in this moment, creating a narrative from what she's found. What I really loved is how experimental this book is about the creative process of writing a novel and the author. And really, this is kind of the headspace of probably how an author comes up with their plots, because the old lady is thinking about this note and creating a whole character profile of who this person is. She's not found a body. She doesn't know whether this is true or not, and she's let her imagination kind of run wild with her. And that has some parallels to The Virgin Suicides, because the girls are dead at such a young age, the boys ruminate a lot on what they could have been and how amazing they are, because they're kind of encapsulated in time as forever young and full of potential. So I do think this will really not appeal to many people because it is so unique, and I have a tendency to really feel connected to these dark stories. I just don't know why, but I gave this 5 out of 5 stars because this book I literally could not put down, and I can't really articulate very well what kind of power she has as a writer to keep you engaged. But a lot of people might think she doesn't, and might think this just doesn't have a plot. But for me, I was just so into this book. I was so with this character. And then the ending, I think, was done quite well as well. So I loved it. Loved it. So there's that one. Then I also just finished last night The Vanishing Half, but I started it earlier in the month and I was juggling a lot of books. And this is so good. So this follows twins Stella and Desiree. I don't know whether it's Desiree or Desiree. I presumed it was Desiree, so apologies if I've got that wrong. And they live in Mallard, which is in Louisiana, and it's a coloured only community, but of lighter skinned black people. And so they don't really fit into the black community or the white community, and often they are asked to work in the white community as housemaids because the white people prefer the lighter skinned black people to live and work in their homes. So At 16, Stella and Desiree decide they want more from this life and they escape Mallard and they flee. And then Stella ends up being able to pass as white in New Orleans where they travel, and she leaves Desiree behind and starts a new life. Then Desiree finds a man called Sam, who's a much darker skinned black man than she is, and she has a fleeting romance that turns very physical. She has a daughter and she returns to Mallard. So this book then kind of takes the story from there and about their daughters, and it explores a lot of topics around things like colorism in the black community and perceptions of whiteness and lightness and colorism in the white community and the ignorance, I presume, that there is around colorism and the identity struggle that comes with colorism. I think the choice of the twins, one of them to marry a white man and one to marry a darker skinned black man, really plays on the idea of colorism and your identity and how much you are connected. And it was a really interesting choice that the twins were the mothers and they were the lighter skinned, and how that really changed the colour of the children that they had and then their perception of their identity. How one feels born into whiteness and one feels born into blackness, and that discussion is just so interesting. Britt Bennett has a beautiful writing style. It is compulsively readable, but not in the same way that Death in Our Hands was, where I had to just keep reading. This had this slow, soft, gorgeous rhythm to it that I really wanted to take my time with. So I didn't want to race through the pages because it was beautiful. It's this epic family saga in 350 pages, and it went through all of the characters. What I loved so much is we got to spend time with all of the main characters. Now, what I usually hate sometimes in these family dramas is that you get a select number of the characters and then some of them we never ever kind of spend an intimate time with. We just hear segments from other characters about what's happened to them, and this doesn't really have their intimate narration. It's kind of third person narrative. It's not first person. We don't really get how they're feeling, but we know intimately from the narration and from the characters' interactions with each other how they're feeling. But it has that kind of cinematography feel, filmic feel of an omnipresent narrator pulling these four characters together, and it's soft and it's gentle. You're not bashed over the head with it. And I really wanted to take my time because I just found each bit as interesting. Now, usually with so much going on, as the sisters had two very different lives and then their children had two very different lives, sometimes you start to pick the bits that are more interesting than others. But I found each element was very well constructed to pull the overall narrative together, and it was chosen for a reason by the author, and therefore my interest didn't wane when we switched to focus on a different character. This is stunning. Now, I know a lot of people have said more impressive things about the mothers than this one. Very recently on BookTube, I've seen a lot of people buzz about the mothers again. I really want to go back and read this, but this is completely worth the hype. This is one of the only books that I have read that from about 20 pages in, I was like, yeah, I'm unanimous with the rest of BookTube. This is a darling, adored it. And I would love to go back and read this in a few years' time because it has that timeless feel about it, and it sweeps through the decades. It deals with the 1950s all the way through to the 1990s, but not in a way that you feel like you've raced through these decades. It's very strange. It feels timeless, and it has some really prominent things to say about things like colorism, which I think is being talked about more in books and the media recently, because it's something that through Black Lives Matter has come to the forefront of Black identity as well. and mixed race identity as well, are things that we don't really pay as much prominence to in these mediums. So it's fantastic that this book is out there, and it gave me so much to think about. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, absolutely loved it. And then let's have a little look what I've got next. So then these are just really quick ones. I listened to Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales on audiobook, and it was only about 3 or 4 hours on audiobook, and now that the gyms have opened again, it was just nice to listen to something a little bit more escapist while I was on the treadmill, something that I didn't have to concentrate too hard on. And I have been thinking that maybe in the next few years I want to read more fairy tales, myths, legends, and get a bit more of a back history. I know Jen over at Jen Campbell, her YouTube channel, she does a lot about the history of fairy tales and about the origins of them, and I know a lot of people are also interested in things like Greek myths and Roman myths and Norse myths and legends. I know Jean, and on her booktube channel she talks a lot about Greek mythology and classics and all that kind of jazz. So I know that it's kind of buzzy on booktube as well, but I want to get into the habit of listening to more of them. And I didn't know whether the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales would differ slightly. I then realised after I listened to it that I also want to listen to the Grimm's fairy tales as well, because I know they are a little bit more dark. So I'm tentatively dipping my toes into the world of fairy tales, and I just wanted to see how it compared with my imaginings of these stories. So it dealt with some of the main classic fairy tales that Hans Christian Andersen wrote, whom he was a Danish writer of fairy tales, and he wrote The Ugly Duckling, which was on it, and Thumbelina and The Little Mermaid. So the Ugly Duckling was very similar to how we all remember it, and The Little Mermaid was interesting because it was slightly different. It didn't really end on a happy note. So it was really easy to get through. The narration was really fun. It had multiple different actors doing voices, and I found it really enjoyable. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It was just something fun to listen to. Then I also listened to the Norse Legends on audiobook, and this dealt with the stories of the creation, and then it went into Thor and Odin a little bit, and some of those stories, and about Loki and his mischief, and set the tone of where these myths and legends go, and a bit of context, because I don't really know much about the Norse myths and legends. Again, this was fun. This was a children's educational audiobook. I think it was originally a CD disc, and so it did have some dramatic music bits that sometimes when I was on the treadmill scared me a little bit because of all these crashing cymbals. But again, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It was really interesting. I have a few books on my bookshelves. I have some Stephen Fry about the Greek legends. I have a book of Norse myths. That's an educational and definitive collection thing. So I am planning to read some of them, and I will look on the library for any Grimm's fairy tales that I can get my hands on. Hopefully in audiobook, because I think they're quite nice in audiobook to listen to and just take you out of yourself. But yeah, I listened to them. Then I read The Supper Club by Laura Williams, and this was really, really good as well. I had a really good first half of December with reading. This is also an interesting book. I don't think everybody will love it, and I did, because I think it has so many rich and interesting things to say. So this follows Roberta, who has a best friend called Stevie, and it plays around with chronology. So at some points we are with Roberta when she's back at home. Sometimes we're with Roberta when she's at university. And then some parts of the novel were with Roberta when she's left university, she's working for a fashion magazine, and she's living with Stevie, her best friend. So Roberta has quite a few traumatic events that happen in her life that kind of shape her attitude to herself. At university, she suffers a rape that she never really deals with, and it kind of comes out in strange behaviour later on in the novel. So she befriends Stevie, and they have this very intense friendship that kind of borders on blurring the lines of what's appropriate. You know, there was an undertone of some kind of sexual tension between the two of them, is all I will suggest. And then Stevie and Roberta get talking a lot. Roberta's really passionate about cooking, and they decide to start a club called the Supper Club and indoctrinate women into this club. And their ethos is that it's a complete feminist organisation where they bin dive for food. They kind of break into locations like Selfridges, university buildings, and they cook and they take drugs and they drink and they party, and it's the ultimate feminist manifesto that they're kind of working on. This is the elite. This is what it's like to be a woman. So Roberta and Stevie have this strange relationship where later on in the novel, Roberta tries to have a more normal life and moves away from Stevie, and Stevie kind of drags her into this crazy behaviour where they're breaking into buildings and committing crimes and throwing food, and the visceral descriptions of the supper clubs are really interesting to read. The animalistic way that they're eating food, they kind of gorge themselves on food because the motto is that women are not taking up enough space, and they will take up space physically by enlarging themselves, by eating and being merry. And so the first ever supper club, when they're really struggling to eat, and then at the end of the party someone vomits in the corner because they've just eaten too much food. It's dark, but very powerful, the descriptions of how Roberta cooks the food and then how people eat the food, and the animalistic way that they'll rip meat off the bones. And then there's some really interesting sections at the beginning of chapters where it will have, I think it's Roberta's voice. It's very ambiguous whose voice it is, but based on the knowledge of the novel you presume it's Roberta because she has the cooking experience, and it goes through how to cook something, so how to make sourdough, and it does it in a really interesting way, talking about how if you do this will happen, and how it needs to be this kind of consistency. There's just this passion about food that I presume the author is really passionate about cooking and food, because it resonates in the novel, and it's just a ever constant presence. And I found that really interesting because cooking books are not really my thing, but the evocative, visceral descriptions of food in here were really, really interesting. So yeah, this book gives you a lot to think about. Whether their ideals were feminist or not is very up for debate. But some of the male characters in here, and I think on purpose, were incredibly frustrating. There is a lecturer that Roberta, while she's at university, has a fling with, and he is an absolute arsehole. The way he talks about her, the way he patronises her. There's a section where she meets him later on in life when she has got a boyfriend and she's trying to stay away from Stevie and get her life on track. And he says some throwaway thing about feminism because she tries to tell him about the supper club. And he is such an arsehole about it. He's like, well, you know, we have to be really careful how we define feminism because your version of feminism and then the original 70s style of feminism is different, and they're different things. And just trying to like talk down to her. And I found that really frustrating because there is no need to patronise people, and there's no need to just make up loads of crap. I met a lot of lecturers in my time who do this, where they just kind of fluff over what you want to say and just throw a few big words in there to try and dissuade you. And when you're an undergraduate, you're kind of googly-eyed and you think that they have the answer. And a lot of people like to just wield what power they have over people, and academics like to do it in words. And whether they're definitively right or not, especially when you take degree subjects that are highly subjective, you know, they will tell you that their opinion is the one to go with. So I loved how she just shot him down in that scene and just walked away. I was just like, yes, there's so many times I wish I could have done that to a teacher at university, but unfortunately I didn't have the skill set or the confidence back then. So it's just a really interesting book. and it's just bursting with life. This author has just so much to give, and you can just tell from this book that this is going to be an author who is really going to come to the forefront, because this has stayed with me. So I've given this 4 out of 5 stars, maybe 4.5, because it was just so bloody good. So there's that. And then I read The Burning Girls by C.J. Tudor. I was given this as an approved NetGalley read. This is published by Penguin Random House. This follows a village called Chapel Croft in Sussex, and there is a female reverend, Jack Brooks, but it's really interesting, this book, because I read the first few chapters and I fell in the trap. So it set it up really clever. This is probably going to spoil it when you guys read it, but it was talking about the reverend, and I was fully like, with my sexist brain on, was like, this is a male reverend. And then there's a bit where she calls a character out because she's like, yeah, it's me, I'm the reverend, I'm a girl. And I had the same moment with the character of being like, what? Oh, this is awkward. I thought you were a man. And so I just thought it was so clever. I was instantly impressed with how she'd done that. And I kind of then felt in safe hands with this book because she knows what she's doing. So anyway, so Reverend Jack Brooks is a reverend in Nottingham. And then there's a bit of a scandal where she's living that it roughly involves her, and they ask her to relocate to Chapel Croft in Sussex to lie low until they can allow her to come back. They're selling it to her by saying it's temporary. And she goes over there with her only daughter, who she's raising single-handedly because her husband died, and again, we don't really know what's going on with that. And then they come to Chapel Croft, and in Chapel Croft they have a really strange and unique tradition, which I believe is actually true because of the way that at the beginning of the novel she puts a wiki page, a bit of information from a wiki page, which suggests that this is a true and unique part of the Chapel Croft history, which is that there were some martyrs during the era of Mary Queen of Scots, where they didn't convert and so they were burnt at the stake. I think it's Christian martyrs. They wouldn't convert to Catholicism or rescind their Protestant beliefs, so they were burnt at the stake. So they became martyrs. So the tradition in Chapel Croft is to have little burning girls, which are like twig dolls that they burn in a ceremony to remember the people that lost their lives because they believed in their faith. So those burning girls become relevant in the story, and I don't want to ruin it because I think this is a really clever thriller, and one that I very much enjoyed, and I loved how all the little bits came together at the end. I didn't see how that was going to happen, and she tied that in really well. There are kind of 3 itty-bitty plot lines going on, and then they all merge wonderfully and competently at the end, which I was very impressed with because as a thriller, I love to be impressed. I love to see that really exciting groundwork that an author makes and links them all together, and you can sit back and trust the author and relax and enjoy the experience. I hate those thrillers where you finish them and say, hang on a minute, that feels a bit like a plot hole, or that didn't quite make sense at the end. I didn't feel that with this novel. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I think it was so impressive. I haven't read any C.J. Tudor before, but this book has made me very excited to go back to her more famous novels. The Disappearance of Annie Thorne, I think, is one of them. And I can't remember the other one. Is it The Chalk Man? Did she write The Chalk Man? Yes, she also wrote The Chalk Man. So I want to go back and read some of them because I remember seeing them all over the place when they came out, and this was a nice way to get to read some of her works, and this is really impressive. So when this comes out in the new year, I would highly recommend you guys go and check out The Burning Girls. It's a really fun thriller and I loved it. And then we're getting to the end, guys, the last 2 books. So the penultimate book that I read was My Best Friend's Murder by Polly Phillips. I also got this approved by NetGalley, and this is published by Simon & Schuster. And this follows 2 best friends, Izzy and Beck, that have a very interesting relationship to one another. It's a bit of a best friend frenemy situation, but Beck adores Izzy, and as the novel progresses, she realises she's in a frenemy relationship that she didn't really realise she was in. Characters like her brother keep kind of telling her there's a reason you should be wary of Izzy. And then we start the prologue of the novel that there is a dead body at the foot of the stairs of the house of the person who died. But we don't know who the person is yet. And then we open the novel with the first chapter, Beck's engagement to her fiancé, and Izzy's hosted the engagement party, and we take it from there. So I'm not going to spoil anything. All I'm going to say is I kind of enjoyed being on a team and picking one out of the other. And it's just a indulgent kind of thriller with these 2 girls. Everybody loves a catty relationship between 2 girls and the dramas and the secrets, and they've been friends for a long time, so there's a lot of history there. It almost feels like a high school thriller drama, because when you get to that age you kind of forage away secrets from each other, and then when they push each other, they kind of reveal them to other characters or set up situations, very high school-esque. So it is very overindulgent, but I kind of loved that. It was just some fun escapism. It was really easy to fly through. And, you know, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I don't think it's the best thriller that I've ever read, but I do think it deals with the relationship between Izzy and Beck really well. I think it was very well written. There wasn't any giant red flags when I read it. There wasn't anything that I thought warranted criticism. But I think the idea has been done before, and so it didn't really elevate my expectations. But it was fun, and I would recommend, if any of it sounds interesting and you kind of want that domestic thriller between 2 friends and secrets, it would make a very good BBC drama, is what I think. A lot of similar things have come out in recent years on the BBC and on Sky Dramas and American TV shows of relationships between 2 people, 2 females, and I think it would be good in that format. And then the last one I read was All That Remains by Sue Black. Now, Sue Black is a forensic anthropologist, and this is a non-fiction about her career. So, for example, she went out to Thailand after the tsunami, and she went to Kosovo after the war there. And her job is really, as an anthropologist, a forensic anthropologist, is to try and piece together the person's life through their death. So she's slightly different than a pathologist. She doesn't need to know the cause of death, but she uses forensic techniques to figure out maybe the rough age, sex, gender, race of a dead body. She can try and figure out through bone construction whether they are young or elderly. She can help identify bodies through clues of what's left on the body and cadavers. And she did some really interesting things in her career. So, for example, just before the London bombing, she contacted Tony Blair, who was our Prime Minister at the time, and said how we really need to implement a police strategy to deal with these mass catastrophes, these terrorist attacks, these mass fatalities, these human disasters, and have a really effective way that we can nationalise across the country how we identify dead bodies in a professional way on a mass scale. So she had a meeting with Tony Blair, and they implemented what is called a disaster victim identification process with the police. And she set up training, which is now nationalised over the UK and is used for things like terrorist attacks, which I found really fascinating. Then she talks about how she worked in the Dundee University and they needed a new grant for their mortuary there because she had helped work with people that have found an alternative to using formaldehyde on cadavers to keep them quite flexible in terms of for surgeons and for pathologists and forensic anthropologists to work on cadavers without them being too rigid. So the freezing method means that when they thaw out, the next group of people can't benefit from them because the constant freezing and thawing damages the body. And then the formaldehyde, a lot of surgeons complained that that technique meant that they were too rigid for certain procedures to practice on. The Thielsen technique is one that they found through research. They implemented a similar thing here in the Dundee University. They used big tanks and they kind of soaked the cadavers in them for a while and did a few experiments and realised it was a really effective technique. But to implement it in the Dundee University, they had to completely change the way that the mortuary was set up and have a big investment. So to get the investment money, she brought in a load of crime writers. She's really good friends with Val McDermid. And they auctioned off characters. They did social media. They all put money together so that the tanks that they were going to buy with the money that was given, they would name after crime writers. So they named the mortuary after Val, and then Stuart McBride had one of the tanks named after him, and Jeffrey Deaver and some other crime writers got involved, which I think was really fun and interesting. That was a really fun part of the book. She also talks about death and dying and people giving up their bodies for medical science and some of the things that she's had to deal with in her career. And this is a really interesting book, I think, for people to read who have a bit of a fear of death. I have a fear of that whole part of our lives, and it's something that I just don't deal with. And maybe that's because of the naivety of youth. I just avoid topics about it entirely. But this book is really good to open up that conversation in a compassionate way. And the way she sees death and how she is ready to face death, I find it is very, very admirable. And it's took some anxiety away for me about this process. So I would highly recommend reading it. It's just really informative. And it made me think a lot about the idea of giving your body to medical science and how it's not quite as morbid and bleak as we think it is, and it really might potentially environmentally as well create a good alternative to the situation we're facing with cremation and burial. But anyway, a fantastic non-fiction. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. While I think there wasn't really an overall theme or a plan to this book, it kind of felt a bit ad hoc about different things she'd done. I think this was important because this was her career, and it was really informative for me to learn the difference between a forensic anthropologist and a pathologist, for example. And so much good stuff in here. I'm really interested in criminology and forensics, and so this was an account that I'm glad I read. So thank you so much, Deborah, for recommending it in the comments. I really enjoyed this book. But that's everything. That's all the books I've read in the first half of December. I will probably be doing my second wrap-up of December, probably the beginning of January, once we've got Christmas out the way. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.